Hey guys, it's Gary. I'm back again, actually for the second time today. Apparently I haven't exorcised all the demons from my computer because I started recording this video. 35 minutes into it, my computer started fritzing out like it did on the previous videos, and I couldn't tell if I should continue on or not 35 minutes into a video. And I don't know how much done, 60% done. So I stopped recording naturally. And when I went back and viewed the video, actually it was fine, even though it froze on my screen. Okay, what am I doing today? Well, I just did Ralph Towner, and I figured, let me do the rest of the boys of Oregon. I don't have as an extensive catalog of the solo releases of the other members of Oregon, and in general, I don't think they've recorded quite as much as a leader as Ralph has. So I thought I might group the guys together and show you their stuff, at least what I have of it. I'm going to start with Paul McCandless, but the very first album I want to talk about by him, which I believe is actually his first solo album, I don't have. It's something called All the Mornings Bring, and it was an album that came out in the 70s. I think I may have seen it in the record shops back in the days when I first got into jazz, very late 70s, early 80s. But I didn't pick it up, or read about it or something. And it was probably his best reviewed album, I want to say, as a solo artist. I've never seen anybody have a bad word to say about it. It didn't come out on CD until about 2010. And so it was a long wait that it was out of print, because even on vinyl it was out of print for many years. Probably from the very early 80s on, I think it was gone in history. An interesting band, supposedly it was Paul McCandless's, the oboe player of Oregon. His first solo album had some musicians on there that are going to be very familiar to fans of Paul's solo works, or at least know of other musicians that he's associated with, because that album basically features a trio, but it's augmented by other musicians. And it's got Dave Samuels on vibes and marimba. It's got Art Landy on piano, and I guess that's kind of like the basic trio of the album. And then they add musicians here or there. I know Eddie Gomez plays bass on some of the album, and there's a woodwind section that plays on another part of the album. But I believe the basic context of that album is built around the trio of Dave Samuels, Paul McCandless, and Dave Samuels on vibes and marimba, and Art Landy on piano, which will be fairly well known to folks who don't have that album, because going back years after that 70s album, and I don't know exactly when that was recorded since I don't have it, but that lineup is going to be fairly familiar to some folks, because in May of '81, the core three guys got together again to record an album for ECM called Skylight. And it's not really a Paul McCandless solo album as much as a trio album. All three boys. Dave Samuels, again on vibes and marimba. Paul McCandless on all the horns, and Art Landy on the piano. Interesting album. This came out, I want to say, it wasn't released until '82. And the interesting thing with it, I read about this in the days before the internet, that it was coming out. And it may have been, I want to say, in Downbeat magazine, which I read religiously for many years. And when it eventually was released, and I did see it inside the paper catalogs that were inside of many of the ECM albums at the time, I saw the album was released, it had a catalog number, it came out in '82, couldn't get a hold of it. Well, apparently, here in the U.S., ECM, it was like every 5 or 6 years would go through a different distribution company. At one point, I want to say Warner Brothers was even releasing their stuff. And Polydor was at various times. But whoever was releasing their stuff here in the U.S., or distributing it here in the U.S., in the early 80s, they instead of just releasing everything that ECM came out with, which was done prior to that by whoever their distribution was, regardless of who it was. In the early 80s, they started kind of cherry-picking things and not releasing some albums at all. And I remember the early 80s, the Adelhart Reudinger album, which, you know, okay, he was unknown, so maybe they thought the sales wouldn't be there. Okay, maybe, but they should have released it because it's a great album. I had to buy that as an import. Saxophonist Alfred Harth, who also, 82-83 period, released a really good album. A bunch of American players on it, too. And they didn't distribute it here in the U.S. again. So I had to buy that as an import. This was the same thing, except I was never able to get this as an import. And I was very frustrated by that. Thankfully, when the CD era came along, this got released fairly early into the CD era. And it's a nice, very chamberish album. Not as pretty as some of Oregon's stuff. It's a little on the difficult tart side. It's almost like it's not an album you would put on as background music, even though there's no real wild percussion going on or anything like that. Art Landy plays piano and a little bit of hand percussion. Dave Samuels on vibraphone marimba and plays a little bit of hand percussion. And Paul McCandless, soprano saxophone, English horn, oboe, bass clarinet, and wood flute. The percussion is very light, but it sounds kind of like a modern classical album, I want to say. Very modern music. And if you're familiar with Art Landy's writing, Art Landy doesn't necessarily write in areas that you can predict what the next chord's going to be, kind of thing. So I think a lot of that is coming from him. A lot of that flavor is coming from him. And they all get writing credits on the albums. Each has tracks that were written solely by that person: Dave Samuels, Art Landy, Paul McCandless, and there's tracks that are written by all three of them. It's only about 41 minutes, not even 41 minutes. Short album, but it's one I like. But it's one of those albums you have to be in the mood for. Good album though. Going on into a real, true Paul McCandless solo album, and I'm trying to figure out when this was recorded. February 1981. So really. Within 3 months of the Skylight album, actually prior to the Skylight album, just 3 months, is this album called Navigator. Now, the CD release came out in 94 after being out of print for many years on a label called Landslide. I'm not familiar with this label, but I remember from reading Downbeat, and I'm pretty sure it was Downbeat, but it could have been Musician Magazine as well. This was a mail-order only album at first. It kind of surprised me because I thought Paul McCandless had a big enough name that he would be recording side projects for a larger label that had distribution in the stores, and I never did see the album in the stores. But I remember when this came out, reading about it and holding on to the magazine because it's like, one of these days I'm going to order that by mail, and I never did. And I'm sure it went out of print. But apparently, and I don't know if the original label was this Landslide recording or whether whoever initially put it out sold the rights to Landslide. But it's apparently a small label. Now the Landslide label is based in Atlanta, Georgia. So again, I don't know if this was the original label or not that it was put out on. But 3 months prior to the Skylight album, this is an interesting album. This is prettier stuff. You get, once again, Paul working with Dave Samuels doing vibes, marimba, percussion, and Steve Rodby on upright acoustic bass. Steve Rodby from the Boston area. Eventually he joined the Pat Metheny group. He wasn't in it yet at this point. And Ross Trout, electric guitar and sitar. And Jay Clayton, a female vocalist. That is interesting because I don't know if she's still around doing stuff. But Jay Clayton, right around, I would say 80, certainly 81, 82, it seems like she appeared on every other jazz album that came out. I even have a solo album by her on vinyl. She was one of those people, I want to say she was part of the New York scene only because I think a lot of the recordings that I have that she's on were recorded actually in New York. And she's one of those people that had this incredible flurry of activity in the early 80s, and then, for me at least, disappeared from the scene. This is a pretty album. This is a good album. You know what? I should have checked. I'm not sure if it's still in print. It came out in 94. Like I said, Landslide is a small, unknown label to me. And this may be the original folks that released it when it was a mail-order only vinyl LP back in the day. But nice 5-piece band. Most of the tracks written by Paul. And Paul's playing soprano, saxophone, oboe, English horn, and bass clarinet on here. And did I show the back? See the band? All the way to the left is Dave Samuels. And Steve Rodby is the guy in the upper, the highest guy with the glasses there. Jay Clayton is all the way off in the corner there. So I guess Russ Trout would be the other guy, and Paul McCandless in the center. Good album, pretty album. Now Paul's done. This was a weird one for me, and I couldn't find the date on this. I want to say this is early 90s, and I'm betting Carm has this. I'm really betting Carm would have this. I saw this, I was surprised. A co-led album by Spencer Brewer, who is primarily a synthesizer player. He plays some piano, but primarily a synthesizer player. Very new agey musician, very much in the new age category. And he came along pretty much in the late 80s, early 90s, put out a whole bunch of stuff, a lot of albums. And it's a co-led album by Spencer and Paul McCandless. Now, I want to say that I think Paul McCandless may have guested previously on some Spencer Brewer albums, but I'm not sure because I don't have them. But they didn't necessarily, I think, record a lot together that are co-credited to them. And I want to say, I know that in the 90s, early 90s, I saw a Nature album that was by Paul McCandless and somebody else, and I want to say it probably was Spencer Brewer. And it was one of those things that's quiet music with nature sounds. And I love nature, but I'm not necessarily a fan of attempting to listen to music while birds are chirping and all that, water's running and all that. To me, it's kind of like a distraction. And I was surprised to see that because of Paul's, history of kind of his serious acoustic music. But I didn't pick that album up, but I'm pretty sure it was another one by Spencer and Paul McCandless. This one I thought when I picked up was a duet album, and I was surprised to see these two guys playing together because I was not really terribly aware of their history. But it's really a full-on band album. Well, in terms of the support, on just about every track is a drummer. There's additional horn players in addition to Paul. There's drummer percussionist Mark Walker, by the way, who is now playing with Oregon. Now, I don't know if this is the first time that Paul may have played with Mark Walker or not. But Paul has the history of recording with drummers on his solo albums who end up becoming the percussionist in Oregon. And here's Mark Walker, years before he joined Oregon. And let me see, French horn player, Mark Walker, drums, percussion, again, Steve Rodby on acoustic bass, also an associate of Mark Walker. I believe they're all out of that Boston area. And Steve Rodby went on to most famously join Pat Metheny Group. But he also produced. He also did some production work on future Oregon albums, too. I know the orchestral album they did with Moscow Symphony. That was a Russian symphonic band that Oregon played with. And I think that was one of the ones that Steve Rodby actually had his hand in as well. So there's a lot of music. I couldn't even list all the musicians on here. There's the very big horn sections and even string sections on some of the tracks, in addition to standard kit drums, acoustic bass played by Steve Rodby, and also bass played by Kay Eckhart, who was a member of John McLaughlin's trio that had Tree Like Urtu in it too, back in the early 90s. So it's probably around this time. Anybody knows who Kit Walker is, the keyboard player? Oddly enough, he also plays on this, which surprises me because Spencer Brewer is a keyboard player too. Easy listen though. It's nice. There's no challenging material on here, but it's really nice because the particular horns that Paul plays combine, I think, well with synthesizers. And if it's recorded correctly, there's a nice wash of sound with Paul's beautiful oboe, especially, and horns playing over it. Very, very easy. You could even put it on as background music. There's nothing real challenging about it. And honestly, I was surprised to see Paul doing this kind of music, to be honest with you. But in a kind of in a good way. He's really stretching out. Paul also, for a few years, recorded for Windham Hill. When they started expanding in the late 80s, after their initial success in the early 80s, in the late 80s, early 90s, they really kind of cast a wider net from the stuff that they started doing, and they started doing albums that were much more in the jazz field. And my favorite Paul McCandless album came out, which is, oh man, this is sad that this is out of print, came out in recorded in 88, called Hearsay. It's just great writing. There's nothing difficult, but it's not just a pretty album. It's very, very orchestral in terms of colors and all that. Probably my single favorite thing that Paul McCandless has ever done is the 8-minute and 50-second track on here called Sojourner. Just because, well, it's really fantastically recorded. And it's very cinematic. It sounds like a theme for a big budget movie. The Sojourner track. There's such rich orchestral textures and colors in here. And there's a fairly large group. But again, it's got old associates on here. Art Landy's playing piano. Steve Rodby once again on acoustic bass. There's several musicians that I am not familiar with, but there's a person who plays additional synthesizers. And interestingly, Paul McCandless himself plays keyboard synthesizers on here. I'm not aware of any other albums he did that. Possibly the follow-up album on Windham Hill also. But for the most part, I haven't heard Paul play keyboard synthesizers, which he does on this album. And a wind controller, which I'm assuming is an electronic wind controller, again, another instrument I'm not aware of Paul playing. He's got a guy named Keith Green playing French horn, and Wally Kane playing flute, piccolo, clarinet, and bass clarinet. Now, it's interesting because Paul himself also plays clarinet and bass clarinet, penny whistle, in addition to the keyboard synthesizers, the wind controller, soprano and piccolo sax, oboe, and English horn. So there's a lot of horns on here, and there's a lot of horns on here, but not necessarily a lot of soloing. This is a very written out, composed album for the most part, and especially the first track that I love so much. Between the synthesizers, and I'm sure Paul is overdubbing himself on horns at times, and you've also got the French horn of Keith Green, which is very noticeable in places, and Wally Kane, whose flute is very noticeable in places. I'm pretty sure those guys aren't playing any solos, if I'm not mistaken, throughout the album. They're basically there to perform the written-out parts, but it sounds like a full orchestra between all of Paul's horns and the additional horn players and the synthesizers, and it's really beautiful. Now, the one person that I didn't mention, well, he's also got 2 synthesizer programmers on here, so it's probably some of those orchestral context is probably coming from the synthesizers as well, since there's a lot of additional people involved, 3 additional people involved with doing various things on synthesizer. Fantastic album. The one musician I didn't mention on here, though, is Trilak Ertu, plays percussion on here. So there's no kit drums. There's there's some kind of drums, nondescript drums, but percussion and tabla. And it is the right mix. Sometimes, if you're real familiar with Trilak, you hear things in his music that do sound like a kit drum, but I'm not aware of very much of it here. Most of it, and especially on that first track, that Sojourner, wow, his percussion's fantastic. It's crisp, it's clean, it's beautifully recorded. One of the best examples of a non-ECM album that I've heard in terms of sound. And it was actually recorded in a studio in California, in Belmont, California. Damn, did they get a good sound on this. And Paul does Beside a Brook, which is a track that Oregon's recorded and performed live for many, many, many years. I think even on their studio albums, Oregon recorded it more than once. But I know that they've played it live many years. It's one of those tracks that constantly gets kind of put into rotation. If you go to see Oregon and they don't play it, and you go see them again a few years later, it might be back in the set list. And then there's a whole bunch of newer tracks that I'm not sure that were ever recorded by Paul again on other albums, and certainly not with Oregon. But And I just picked this up on a whim. I didn't hear anything from it first. Oh, damn, is that it? This would be the one Paul McCandless album, just that cinematic orchestral beauty to it that I would absolutely pick up if I could only have one. No doubt, that would be it. Now that was in '88. He recorded again. I'm not sure that I'm missing something. In late '91, he recorded another album for Windham Hill. And that's quite a few years in between, at least in terms of jazz musicians. I'm not sure if he was doing other things with Oregon during that time, I'm sure. I'm not sure if he was involved in other side projects, because that's kind of a bit of a gap. But he records this other album called Premonition, which I very quickly picked up after the Hearsay album, loving it so much. And this is a complete 180. This is so different from the Hearsay. And at first I was disappointed, though again, it's very well recorded. But Hearsay is, and Paul does it solely as a leader. Now, let's say it was recorded in late '91, came out in '92. Boy, is this different, though. This is essentially a really good smooth jazz album, or contemporary smooth jazz almost. If he was ever going to get played on smooth jazz radio, the track would be from this album. So at first I was disappointed, though later on, in re-listening to it, it's better than 90% of the smooth jazz out there. It's kind of slick. There's nothing avant-garde. There's no chamberish, and chamber music is something that is almost always present on a Paul McCandless album. And there's really none of that here, because he uses standard drummer, bass player, guitarist, electric bass, even uses Lyle Mays on piano, but it doesn't sound like the Pat Metheny group all the same. But William Kennedy on drums, who was the drummer, and I think he was the drummer at this time still, with the Yellow Jackets, plays on here. He's a standard kit drummer. Gary Brown plays fretless bass. Steve Cardenas on acoustic guitar. Fred Simon on synthesizer programming. I love Fred Simon. Too bad he didn't play on here. It looks like he gets a synthesizer programming credit and an additional keyboards credit, but he only gets the additional keyboards credit on one track, it looks like. No, on 2 tracks. So it looks like he actually plays on 2 tracks and gets synthesizer programming credit for many tracks. One of the tracks he plays on, though, let me see, is actually the title track, which is just a duo of Paul McCandless on soprano sax and Fred Simon on keyboards. I have to give this another listen. There might be some more value to this than I'm thinking. So there's no rhythm section there on that track alone. But most of the album has William Kennedy on drums, Gary Brown electric bass, Steve Rodby even plays a little bit on here, electric bass. Steve Rodby again around. And there's also a very short reprise of one track, which is just Paul McCandless and Lyle Mays. Looks like Lyle Mays plays a little bit on a few tracks too. Strictly piano. It's a good smooth jazz album. It's probably unlike a lot of chamber jazz to me. I love is not necessarily the kind of thing you listen to in the car. Too quiet, too down tempo. Unless you're going for a relaxing drive out in the country, then it's perfect. But for running errands and making a trip to do necessary things, most chamber jazz isn't up tempo enough for me, maybe. But this would be a good smooth jazz album to take on a ride with you, and it's got quite a bit more substance than the things that you would typically say are smooth jazz. And again, I think this is out of print. Paul actually said he was really happy with the way this album turned out, but it was an obvious turn toward a more commercial direction. And just a couple things. I've shown this before. Side projects, which is the thing I like to do. Paul did more side projects than I will ever be able to keep track of. But he played on fellow Oregon member Ralph Towner's solo album, City of Eyes. And I want to say this is 88. Yeah, November 88. Rare appearance. I think his only appearance on a Ralph Towner album, along with Jerry Granelli, the drummer. And believe it or not, he also plays, and I have this on album. Let me show it to you because I pulled it. See? I got the vinyl too. My favorite Carla Bley album, which is probably her most accessible album, so a lot of people wrote this one off as being smooth jazz. Well, no, it is more accessible, but I don't... Yeah, it's more accessible than her other stuff. I wouldn't necessarily call it commercial. But I love it. And if you see the main band there, he's not listed there. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, her six-piece band, which was her basic working band. But the first guy listed in the smaller print, along with John Clark, who you may know, who did an ECM recording, Randy Brecker on trumpet, as Paul McCandless, as well as 2 other horn players. The reason I believe that they're listed in smaller print is the guys at top are Carla's band at the time, and that's the touring band. And the other guys, including Paul, I'm fairly sure are they're not soloists, they're strictly playing written parts. There's a lot of, one of my favorite things about this album is the background horn charts that are written out. They're absolutely stunningly beautiful, and yet they remind me of the 60s in the best possible way. There's a lot of, the style of the writing of the background horns are so pretty, and it's very much the kind of thing, without realizing it, if you watch 1960s era, even some TV shows and movies, if you hear a fairly big band in the background playing the incidental music that goes along, it sounds a lot like that. The way that those charts are written out, very, very pretty. I love it. So a lot of times I end up just focusing on the background horn parts that Carla wrote. And so I think all those guys in the small print are basically playing those pre-written parts, and they don't get to solo. But in the tracks that they appear on, which are most of the tracks in the album, actually, they're fairly important parts. It's just that they're not soloing. And the weird thing is I don't know if, I'm sure he did it, but I'm not aware of too many other Paul McCandless sessions where he went in and only played written parts. Usually if he's on an album, he's a guest soloist. So that's an interesting thing, and I love those horn charts. And that's it for Paul. That's not everything he did, that's just everything I have. Now we get on to the late, great Collin Walcott, another original member of Oregon. Their hand percussionist, largely tabla, and sitar as well. And occasionally actually would play guitar. And there's a couple older albums. I want to say even Winterlight might be one of them, which is one of my favorite Oregon albums, that I remember seeing Collin Walcott having a guitar credit as well. Wow, with Ralph Towner on there, it's interesting that Ralph allowed it, or that, whatever, that you would even want another guitar besides Ralph. But it works, because I'm pretty sure it's Winterlight it's on. It's one of my favorite Oregon albums. But this was recorded in March '75. I believe this is Collin's first solo album, Cloud Dance. And again, this, along with Don Cherry, I think this is one of those albums that is in a bin that I forgot to take when I moved, because I have both of Collin's solo albums on vinyl, and I never found them. So I think I know some of the other albums that are with them, and I think some Oregon albums that I'm missing are with them. Don Cherry, Collin Walcott, I'm really discouraged, but I kind of, if I was going to forget to take something with me when I moved, I kind of wish it was my old rock records. Seems like I got most of those. But this is an interesting album. This is, I believe, his first solo album, recorded March 1975, when Oregon was very, very busy, very much happening. One of the early peaks of their career, really, which would have been the mid-'70s to the early '80s. Oregon was a force to be reckoned with, and recording a lot of albums and doing a lot of tours. And it's a wonder that these guys got a chance really to record anything as side projects. On Cloud Dance, recorded in '75, his entire backing band is the Gateway Trio. of John Abercrombie, in this case pretty much only playing electric guitar, Dave Holland on upright bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. Now, I want to say, I know 75 was when the first Gateway album came out. I'm not sure what month it was recorded, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that the first Gateway album was recorded probably right around the same time, probably within a month or two, that they were in the studio. And Collin was offered to do a solo album, kind of looked and saw the guys there or something. So it's interesting. It's because it doesn't sound like a Gateway album. Gateway has their own sound, and yet all it is Gateway with Collin Walcott on sitar and percussion. And yet, most of the tracks are written by Collin. They do a Dave Holland track, actually. And there's 2 tracks that were co-written by Collin and John Abercrombie. There's a track called Scimitar, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's interesting because it's also included on Collin Walcott's Works compilation album. And when I was playing that compilation album, this track came up, and I'm like, gee, I don't... And basically what that track is just a duet of guitar and Collin Walcott. So it's just John Abercrombie and electric guitar. But when it came on his Works compilation, which is all, different tracks and different permeations of musicians taken from different albums, I'm like, how come I don't remember there being a duet of just a horn and tabla drums? And it turns out it's not a horn. It was actually from Cloud Dance, and it's John Abercrombie using this really odd processed sound on guitar that I never heard him use otherwise. And it sounds a bit like an oboe, but essentially it sounds like some kind of Middle Eastern or Indian reed instrument, something that you might hear in like a Turkish orchestra or something. And I don't know how he got that guitar sound, and he only plays single lines on it, single notes, so he doesn't play any chords that give it away. But the sound, and I'm sure it's intentional, sounds just like a horn wailing over, and it's kind of in that oboe range. And it's very, very interesting. And I had to grab the Work compilation and see, well, what's this from? And when I saw that it was from Cloud Dance, I'm like, well, there's no horn players on Cloud Dance. And I just had to listen closely to it and realize, oh, crap, that's the guitar. Very interesting. For his next solo album, and essentially really his last solo album, done just entirely under his own control, recorded also for ECM in February of 77, is this album, Grazing Dreams. He put together a different band for this one, and this is more maybe like the kind of music I think of when I think of Collin Walcott, because I always think of mostly acoustic music and very much world music. And obviously the Cloud Dance album had Gateway as a trio supporting him. And I don't necessarily think of drum kit and electric guitar when I think of Collin Walcott, which was on Cloud Dance. On this album, once again, he does use John Abercrombie, but Abercrombie plays electric guitars and also acoustic guitars, which he didn't do on the first album. And he plays his electric mandolin, which I love. I'm always going on about how beautiful and perfect, how much I love John Abercrombie's electric mandolin playing. And whenever it's on an album, I'm always happy. Upright bass of Pally Danielson. And percussion, but not necessarily drum kit, of Dom Amramao playing berimbau, tambourine, and just it's listed as percussion. I don't recall there being a whole lot of drum kit on here. It's more kind of ethnic hand drumming percussion. And also the great Don Cherry, the late great Don Cherry, on trumpet, wood flute, and dusunguni. The dusunguni is that African. It's got 3 or 4 strings. It's essentially referred to as an African guitar, but because you basically play one note at a time, it's more like a bass. It's more like an acoustic bass guitar almost. But you've almost got Cadona on here, which was the next thing that Collin went to. This is I don't want to say I prefer this over Cloud Dance, but I think I just would pull this out and play this a bit more often. Simply because it's got more colors going on in it. You know, you got Abercrombie not just on electric guitar, but he's playing acoustic, he's playing the electric mandolin. You got Don Cherry all over the place, who's my favorite trumpet player, so I'm never going to complain when he shows up on an album. Upright bass, and Dom Amramao, who plays a lot of different styles of hand percussion and instruments, so it keeps the instrumental mix interesting. And that was really his second and last solo album that Collin did, because Collin decided that he didn't like so much being a band leader, I guess, because the very next year, in September of '78, he went back to speak with Don Cherry, and also picked up in the process percussionist Nana Vasconcelos, Egberto Gismonti's longtime collaborator. And September '78, they recorded the first Cadona album. So you got Nana, who's playing berimbau and percussion and does voice. Don Cherry, who's still doing trumpet, flutes, Disingunian voice. Collin playing sitar tabla, doing voice also, and also playing some hammered dulcimer, which he didn't do enough of because it's always really effective when he does it. And a lot of people I've seen really like the first album best. There they are in the studio. Collin, Don, and Nana. Great band. And this band, again, would probably have continued recording had Collin not passed away. That was their first album. Their second album, which I only have on vinyl, and I missed the opportunity to get it on CD when it was available. Now I've got to buy all three in a set, and I already have two of them in order to get the second one on CD. Cadona 2, recorded May of 1980. So it was a couple years before they were able to get together again. I have shown this vinyl before. But there's the three of them. There's Don, and I guess that's the Disinguni right there that we hear so much about. And it looks like it might not even have more than 2 strings. It's got that huge bowl there with a hole in it. That is the reverberation chamber there. Collin in the middle, and Nana. Another Cadona album. Pretty much the same instrumentation, and the only slight difference is Collin also plays a little bit of timpani drum on here. But good album. I really wish I had that on CD, but I don't. And so it took over 2 years for them to get back into the studio, with, I guess, Oregon's schedule being so busy. And another, all the way September '82, it looks like this was recorded. Yeah, September '82 it took to get the next Cadona album, the third Cadona album, and the last one, unfortunately, because Collin passed away. I'm pretty sure it was in '84, the following year. So I'm sure they would have recorded more than that. So again, it's the same lineup. It's got Don Cherry, Nana Vasconcelos. How can you complain? And once again, there's a slight difference in that. Is it Don Cherry? Yeah, Don Cherry plays a little bit of organ on here, electric organ. I believe it's only on one track, and it's the only electric instrument on any of the 3 Cadona albums. They're all very purely acoustic albums. And Collin also, once again, plays a little bit of the hammered dulcimer on here, which is a great color, especially in an acoustic band. It just adds a nice acoustic space to the music, I guess. I really can't describe it any better than that. And I mentioned this was when I did the ECM Works video. I don't know if I remember to show this one or not. There were two batches of ECM Works that came out. The initial one, which was most of the albums, and I believe they were released simultaneously, pretty much. And then a couple years later, I want to say, they did do a second batch, and it was not as numerous as the first batch. It was almost like oops, we forgot to include these artists in the first batch, because they had John Abercrombie in the second batch, and it was odd that he wasn't in the first batch. Bill Frisell came in the second batch. Pat Metheny Volume 2 came in the second batch, but he was in the first batch also. And this one. Lester Bowie also came in the second batch. And Collin Walcott. And Collin's is the only one that actually, oddly enough, is CD length. All of those original ones in the Works series were 50 minutes or under, like anywhere from like 40 to 50 minutes, so they were LP length. This is the only one that actually comes in at 60 minutes. It comes exactly at 60 minutes. And I believe that I saw that this did come out on vinyl. So I don't know if they had a cut tracks on vinyl. I know you can easily fit 50 minutes on a vinyl album. 60 is starting to push it a little bit. So I don't know if on the vinyl incarnation of this they left off a track or not. But it's an interesting selection. Obviously, it has things from all three Cadona albums. It's a good I don't know how available this is. I'm sure there's at least used copies around. But this is a really good introduction if you think you would like Collin Walcott or you don't have anything by him. Because all of his solo albums are recorded for ECM, which is perfect when it comes to compiling an album, because this way you're getting a flavor of everything. All three Cadona albums are represented here. His first two solo albums, Grazing Dreams and Cloud Dance, are also here. And there's even one track from one of the albums that Oregon recorded for ECM, and a very short track from a Steve Ellefson album that Collin played on. And I have that album, so I'll show that too. But this is a good compilation. That's a real good one if you don't have a solo stuff to go sample it. And again, as side projects go, the only reason I bought this is because I didn't know at the time anything about Meredith Monk. I took a look at the album, and the primary musicians on here are Meredith Monk doing voice piano, Mini Moog and Casio keyboards, and Collin Walcott. Now, Collin's only listed with playing didgeridoo here. I don't know if at the time, because this is early 80s, this is 82, I don't know if at the time I even knew what a didgeridoo was. But Collin also plays organ on here as well. They're the two primary musicians on here because it looks like all the other musicians are vocalists. It's a very vocal-oriented album. And honestly, the writing's a little quirky. It's not my cup of tea. But the reason I bought it was because Collin was on it, oddly enough. And I just was interested in seeing him work in a band context where the band was not his, where he was just a sideman. But not really an easy listen. This is an ECM new series, by the way, which I didn't even realize it was, which is kind of like their serious classical arm of things. But yeah, there's a lot of voices on here, so it's very oriented toward voices. No, Collin does organ though. He's the only instrumentalist that plays an instrument besides voices on here, besides Meredith Monk, herself a keyboard player and writer. Quirky stuff. I haven't really followed her career much, to be honest with you. Probably my favorite sideman gig album project that Collin did, though, is Dawn Dance. The only album, I believe it's an African guitarist, I want to say South African, I'm not sure, Steve Ellefson recorded for ECM. And Steve Ellefson only plays 6-string acoustic guitar on here. And the only other musician that plays on here is Collin. That made me buy it. Actually made me buy it. The vinyl. Here it is. At least this one I was able to find. But it's just acoustic guitar, 6-string, and Collin Walcott on percussion. Interesting album. It's a little hard to maintain interest when all the tracks are based around just a 6-string guitar, but there is overdubbing. There's not a lot of... there's only a couple instances where there's a slightly different sound to the acoustic guitar. There's a slightly different, maybe, reverb processing or something. But apart from that, the album is mostly a standard, very clean 6-string guitar sound, but overdubbed. So there's... it's a bit more richer of a sound than a live thing would be. And Collin playing percussion. He doesn't play sitar on here, but he plays a lot of percussion, a lot of, not just tabla drums on this. And he also gets 2 writing credits. I don't know if they were improvisations or not. 2 co-writing credits, I should say, with Steve Ellefson. And a third one, a track called Awakening, that's only 84 seconds long, but it's just Collin solo. It's no guitar. It's just Collin, basically, from what I remember, just playing like various bells and kind of creating an atmosphere. I kind of wish it would go on for longer than 84 seconds. Oddly enough, they chose that track to include on Collin's Works compilation, so even that's on there. They could have, and maybe should have, I think, on that Works compilation, included a regular track from here where you hear Steve and Collin playing together. Now, I read a story online just a couple years ago that Steve Ellefson was scheduled to do a second album with ECM, which never came to fruition. And it was because the recording date was already set and Steve Ellison, I think he went skiing or something like that, and ended up breaking a leg just about a week prior to the scheduling the date that the recording schedule for the second album was set to happen. And because of the way that he broke his leg, he couldn't play guitar. I guess he just couldn't physically sit the guitar on his lap or on his leg properly enough to play guitar. And the recording date got canceled, and he apparently just never kept in contact with Manfred Eicher when he was healed to say, okay, let's do that album now. And I believe actually stopped playing for a number of years, which is a bad move when you get, an international release like this. This was released in America. This wasn't one of those, surprisingly, early 80s ECM albums that the record company, this was Warner Brothers at the time, chose not to release. Which is strange because Steve Ellison was completely unknown in this country. And they didn't release Skylight album, which was recorded also in 1981, which is when this was recorded. And yet the Skylight album had all American musicians on it. And they released this one. When I say released, I mean distributed in the U.S., I should have said. Because this is a prime album for them to look at, and Warner Brothers saying, well, we're not going to get sales out of this. Nobody heard of this guy before, despite Collin being on it. And yet this got released, and I remember going to the record shop, not knowing of its existence, and flipping through the new releases and seeing an ECM album, and I don't know who this guy is, but it's guitar, and there's Collin, and I'm going to buy it. And I like it. I really like that album. Next. Who's left? Mr. Glen Moore, the bassist of Oregon, co-founding member. I don't have any particular order to do these in, do I? Not really. Here's a couple albums he recorded. Strictly, here's one from '99. I'm not going to do this in any order. Glen Moore. Is this Nude Bass Ascending is the name of it. Weird, because they don't put it on the cover, did they? Or did they? Is it there? Nude Bass Ascending, yeah. I never knew how to pronounce Arto's name. Arturo Tonkabankian, who actually played on an Oregon album after Trilak Ertu left the band. He was one of two guys. Him and Mark Walker both played on one Oregon album. Northwest Passage, I want to say, I think is the name of it. And it's almost like at that point they decided to keep Mark Walker as their full-time percussionist, but Arturo actually plays on one Oregon album as well. Maybe this is where he got introduced to Glen Moore, I'm not sure. But Carla Bly plays on here. Oddly enough, electric bassist Steve Swallow plays on here. And boy, these names. I should have Carm on my speed dial and ask him how to pronounce names, because he's always so much better at it than I am. Rabi Abu Khalil, who is somebody that Glenn recorded a bunch of albums with as his bassist, and he appears on this album as well. I haven't listened to this for a long time. That's an interesting gathering of musicians. Carla on obviously on keyboards, Steve Swallow on bass, Arturo on percussion, and Rabib, I believe, is playing sitar. This has a sleeve on it, so if you bear with me. But I mean, he plays sitar, but I'm going to assume that he plays on it. Oh, Glenn also plays piano on here. Glenn plays bass and piano, and Carla plays organ. Steve, electric bass. Oh, I'm sorry, Rabib Abul Khalil, actually oud player, the stringed instrument. And Arturo plays percussion and does some voice things. Interesting band. Well, you got the couple there. You got Steve Swallow and Carla Bly, which pretty much go together a whole hell of a lot, don't they? So that's an interesting album by him. He's got, Glenn's got quite a lot of interesting. He doesn't repeat himself on his solo albums a whole hell of a lot. He seems to be almost like a Jim Hall. Jim Hall always was looking for different permeations of how to do things. Now here's one I really like. Glen Moore, Dragon Eddie's Dream, and this is one of his. I want to say like recent ones. When I say recent, I mean probably anything in the last 20 years. This is '95, so it's on Intuition. which was Oregon was recording for Tuition, weren't they? Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were at this time. Solo bass album, by the way, a few solo bass fans out there. There are no other musicians on this album. This is just all Glen by himself, and even has a complete equipment list, including like what type of bow he uses for his upright bass. He plays piano, I want to say, on one track, because I remember there being one track that stands out as being different. Yeah, and it's listed as Steinway piano, but there's only one track. And he actually plays a Scott LaFaro, the bassist for the Bill Evans Trio, the late bassist. He plays a Scott LaFaro tune on here. But most of the tracks are originals by Glen. I think actually, yeah, he dedicates one to Collin Walcott, who at this point had already passed on. A track called Walcott's Pendulum. And if you remember who Tanya Harding, the skater, was, he dedicates a track to her that's called "If You Can't Beat 'Em, Beat 'Em." So for those that know Tanya Harding's situation, that's fairly funny. And I guess that was going on in '95. Very well recorded upright bass, solo upright bass, one track, very, very, very pretty piano track. If you could stand to listen to upright bass, this is really the top of the heap for me. And he's a good bass player, but I can't rate him higher than like some people like Mark Johnson, Eberhard Weber, Bar Phillips, and people like that. So maybe I didn't, or Dave Holland, or maybe I didn't expect it to be as good as it is being a solo bass album, but man, he pulled it out on this one. It's a great album. It's a great solo bass album. And here's some of his side projects. Oh, I forgot to say what year that was. I don't know if I can tell. Well, 95. I did mention that. Here, Enya Records. The guy whose name I can't pronounce. Abul Khalil. Rabib Abul Khalil, who Glen played the bass in his group on several albums. The oud player playing oud, Rabib, and he also plays flute on a couple tracks. This is a great band. Charlie Mariano, my favorite saxophone player in the whole world. I forgot he plays on this. This album came out in '87. I don't see the recording date, but it was obviously fairly around that time period. So Charlie Mariano and soprano and alto, Glen on upright bass, and Glen Velez on percussion. There's also an Indian percussionist who plays some more traditional Indian style percussion on here. A marimba player on one track, and a guest piano player on one track. Obviously very earthy, very much a world music album. You almost would expect Collin to be on here if he was around. At that point he wasn't anymore. But very much, I like the Enya label a lot. But I think most of their stuff is out of print now, and they're very hard to get. And they were easy back in the days, the vinyl days, when these albums were new. They had really good distribution here in the U.S. And when the CD era came around, they were around for a while, but like every time I look for something on Enya now, it's gone and out of print. So I don't know. If the label's around, they got really lousy or non-existent distribution here in the U.S. Here's another 1991 recording by the same gentleman. There you go. With Glen Moore. So Glen Moore was like part of his band at the time. Apparently, this was actually okay. This one does have a recording date. It was recorded in October 1990. Came out in 91. With again Rabi Abu Khalil on oud, Sonny Fortune on alto saxophone. So another example of a more mainstream jazz saxophone player contributing to this basically world music album. They had Charlie Mariano on the prior album, Glen Moore on bass again, and I believe that's the same Indian hand percussionist that played on the last album. And another Indian percussionist playing frame drums, I guess essentially picking up the Glen Velez role from the prior album. But all originals by Abu Khalil. October 1990. Another pretty earthy, acoustic, nice world music album. And here's another thing that Glen has done, and there's a whole. I only have one of these. He is Nancy King is a singer that actually appeared on one track as a vocalist, as a pure jazz, bebopish mainstream vocalist. Actually appeared on one track of an Oregon album during the Trilok Gertu era. It's probably around 88 or 89 or so, I want to say. And they consider it a duo, and I'm not sure if they go out as a duo and do performances. I thought I heard Glen interviewed once that said that he did do duet performances with Nancy King, just voice and bass. And they recorded a whole series of albums together, and in fact, they've known each other for many years, and I want to say even maybe back to prior to the formation of Oregon. So somehow Glen's been involved with her and knows her for many years. When I bought this, I thought this was a duet album. They had a whole bunch, and I decided, it's not going to be my thing. She's kind of a mainstream singer type of thing. She's not like in the Norma Winstone kind of style or anything like that. She's very much a singer of lyrics and a scat singing. She does a scat singing thing a lot. That's her area. And I thought it was a duet album because there's nothing on here that told me it wasn't. But essentially, it's pretty much a full group. It's got Benny Wallace on tenor sax, Art Landy on piano, Junior Homrich on percussion. It's somebody I don't know. Another percussionist, and Paul English on Hammond organ. So it's more like a regular band. It's got piano, organ, percussion, saxophone, Glen on bass, and Nancy on vocals. So it's almost like a backing band for a mainstream jazz singer. I kind of remember it being, apart from thinking it was just a bass and voice recording, once I saw that there was a full band on it, I wasn't surprised by the style. It's very, very, very much a mainstream kind of thing. But oddly enough, Glen actually writes quite a bit of the material, and actually his wife writes the lyrics. And I'm looking at this, and the first 4 songs are all written actually by Glen Moore, with his wife Samantha doing the lyrics. And they do a vocal version of Sonny Rollins' St. Thomas on here. And there are songs here that are written by Nancy King as well. And they also do I Got Rhythm, which will kind of tell you the overall vibe of the album. It's much more of a mainstream thing. But I didn't realize that Glen had written actually probably more of the material on the album than anyone else. Actually came from Glen and his wife. It's interesting because it's not at all the kind of music you would associate with Oregon. And they've done a whole series of albums, and I want to say I think they still play together, Nancy King and Glen. I think to this day they still play together. And also, and this is a band that doesn't exist anymore, but did, and I don't know, I want to say the late 80s and certainly into the 90s. And he must have got the idea from Collin Walcott to use the name. There's several recordings, and I only bought one of them. This one has a 94 date on here, and I don't see any recording dates, but I want to say 1994. Mokave, a trio, just like Cadona, where they took the name, the first 2 letters, in this case, the names of the last names of the 3 primary musicians in the band. So it's Larry Karush on piano, and Glen Velez on frame drums, and Glen Moore on bass. As a basic trio, very much in the Cadona vibe, but it's piano, bass, and frame drums. So it doesn't sound all that world music-y necessarily. It doesn't sound like a mainstream bebop jazz group, but it's nice. And they did at least 3 albums that I know of, and it was just one of those things like Nancy King. I just wanted to sample it, And if I ever come across and I could get the others relatively inexpensively, I would do so. But this was another band that is running in conjunction with Oregon. And another thing that Glen is involved in, amongst his sideman gigs and his solo album gigs and all this stuff, except for this one's a little bit different than Condona in that they bring a few guests in. They have a guy who plays a bass flute on one track, and they actually, in addition to Glen Velez, have 3 different percussionists on here. So it's odd. So it's like a trio, but with guests. And it's strange. I don't know why they just don't have Glen Velez, honestly, just overdub if they want more percussion, more parts. But they have John Bergamo, who I actually have a solo album by. He's not somebody I know anything about, except I saw an album, and I want to say I think it's solo percussion, so I bought it. Junior Homrich, another percussionist. Bob Fernandez, another percussionist. There's actually all 3 of those guys play on the same 3 tracks. So there's these 3 tracks on this album out of 9 that are very percussion heavy, obviously, because these 3 guests play percussion on the same 3 tracks in addition to Glen Velez. So that makes 4 percussionists on 3 of the tracks of the album. And I guess, okay, so the other 6 tracks are basically the trio, and one of those tracks has a guest flute player. But tracks written by Glen Moore, Larry Karush. They do a John Abercrombie track, Parable, which is a beautiful ballad from my favorite John Abercrombie album, from Characters. And I want to say, I think he recorded it on the Arcade album as well. I know John did a version of one of the tracks on Characters, his old solo album, on the Arcade album, which was his quartet with Richie Byrock on piano. They do a Scott LaFaro tune, the bassist, again, from Bill Evans' band. That probably was Glen's idea. And actually, there's only one track that's actually co-credited to Glen Velez, which makes me think it's probably a jam session thing. But Larry Karush and Glen Moore doing most of the work there. It's an interesting album. It's worth listening to, but I was a little disappointed, especially because this is from the early '90s. Could have been recorded better. Again, this is Audio Quest music. This is not a label I'm familiar with. I would definitely check out their other albums. And again, you know what? This is going on that pile of the few discs that I want to listen to when I'm done here, because I really haven't listened to it much. I've showed this before, and again, this is one of the lost vinyls. Ralph Towner with Glen Moore, trios and solos. This again was, a side, I would say a side project, but I mean, this was the contractual obligation where they couldn't use the name Oregon, and I'm not really sure if they really wanted it to be a Ralph Towner album, because they credited it to 2 of the guys that are in Oregon, and the other 2 guys in Oregon also appear on the album, but not on any one track. But considering it's considered to be a Ralph Towner solo album, and all 3 members of the original Oregon play on it, Glen Moore gets the most space out of all of them. He even gets a solo track to himself, as well as playing in different permeations of trios with the group. He plays with Towner, and then he also plays with Towner and McCandless together. So there's a bunch of, and Towner, McCandless, and Moore play together on one track. Towner, Moore, McCandless. Actually, they do 2 tracks as a trio together. And Glen gets a lengthy bass solo track on here too, without Ralph. I showed this recently, but just show, and that was from 72 or 73, November 72. This is one of the, and my last one that I have to show, actually, from Glen Moore. Jerry Granelli, I mentioned recently in my Ralph Towner video. He is a drummer that played on, I think it's City of Eyes album, that Paul McCandless was also a guest on Ralph Towner's solo album from '88. And for some reason, I got in my head that I thought Jerry Granelli might be one of the guys that might be chosen to replace Collin Walcott after Trilak Ertu left Oregon. That didn't happen, because Jerry Granelli, Granted, he only played on the one Ralph Towner album, but then Ralph Towner went and recorded 2 albums with Jerry Granelli back in the late 80s. I want to say, I think it was about 88. And again, he comes into the Oregon orbit, because here's this album called Forces of Flight by Glen Moore and Jerry Granelli. I really like this. It's an oddball record, but I really dig this. Could be, I really like that solo bass album he did, Dragon Eddie's Dream, but this is vying for first place with me. And it's interesting because it's quite an unusual gathering of musicians. It's got Jerry Granelli, the drummer, who plays acoustic. He's mostly a drummer playing acoustic drums, but he also plays electric drums, and he actually plays a drum machine. Some minimal synthesizer on here, and I want to say it's more like an effects thing on the drums. I don't recall there being a lot of synthesizer on here. Glenn obviously plays his upright bass, and that's all he's credited with, though he's credited with digital effects, but I believe that's digital effects on the bass. And on a couple tracks, there's Annabelle Wilson, who's a vocalist, and I haven't listened to this in years, and this is another one on my stack I'm going to listen to when I'm done here. I don't think she sings lyrics. I think she's only a guest in spots, and I believe she does some wordless vocals, because I don't recall her contributions standing out in a bad way on the album. Like all of a sudden you're listening to this album of essentially bass and percussion, and all of a sudden there's a vocalist there on a couple of the tracks. It doesn't stand out. It works well in the context. This is unfortunately very obscure. Jerry Granelli's solo albums are pretty obscure. What the hell record label is it? Pacific? It looks like the name of the label is Pacific. But it also says ITM. Let's see here. ITMP. It looks like ITM Pacific. I don't know what that stands for. Recorded in 1990, October 1990. If you find this, if you can grab the concept of it, it's a very interesting album. But like I said, there's no piano, there's no guitar. It's essentially bass and percussion. If you're a fan of bass and you like bass and percussion together, and you don't necessarily need to hear a lot of other instruments, try to find a copy of this. This is a really good album. Really good album. I dig it. Okay, this is ridiculous. 67 minutes. I have Tree Like Gertu solo stuff, but you know what? It's going to have to wait, because I don't want to even risk what happened the first time I was trying to do this. Tree Like Gertu, maybe I'll include as a side note when I do Oregon or something like that, or I'll bunch him in with somebody else. Anyway, guys, I know you're disappointed that I haven't done Debbie Gibson yet, but the reason I haven't done it is because I have 30 different editions of Electric Youth, and I'm comparing them all and taking notes, which is her standout album, obviously. And I want to do a lot of details. That one might be over 90 minutes, because it has to be. But apart from that, I really thanks for, I am still really upset that my Ralph Towner video got as screwed up as it did. And I can't redo that, but sorry, hopefully this one is not the same. And I'm keeping it CD length, so it's 68 minutes now, I think. Okay, guys, I hope there's some value in this. And if there's not, sorry. Okay, I'll be back soon. Thanks so much for watching, and your comments and your friendship and everything. Guys, I'll be back soon. Bye.